Scott Burnside, ESPN.com, alongside Frank Provenzano, longtime NHL executive and now part of the ESPN.com trade deadline team. Frank, we had a big deal. I'm going to call it a blockbuster.
Yep.
Keith, I think it's fair to call it that.
Especially this trade deadline, it definitely qualifies as a blockbuster.
All right. Well, we've got Keith Yandle of the Arizona Coyotes going to the New York Rangers, principal piece in that move. We've heard Keith Yandle's name a lot over the last 2 or 3 years. One of the top scoring defensemen in the last 4 or 5 years. He, along with defensive prospect or minor pro defenseman Chris Summers, a 4th-round pick in 2015, will go to the New York Rangers in exchange for top prospect Anthony Duclair, a 1st-round pick in 2016, a 2nd-round pick in 2015, and defenseman John Moore will go to the Arizona Coyotes. Let's talk about the Rangers first. I guess the Rangers are in it to win it.
Yeah, they clearly look at their competitive horizon as now. I mean, they have Henrik Lundqvist, one of the better goalies or one of the best goalies in the world. And the East is wide open this year. I think what they're really doing is, like you said, that you've alluded to, they've acquired one of the top or premier offensive defensemen in the league that is available. And it's a preemptive strike in a sense in that it gives them a year to try and re-sign him since he's got a year. So it's not a rental. You know, they have essentially 2 playoff runs. And they have a shot to maintain their spot as a top 10 power play.
One of the things about Keith Yandle, I think when we talk about him, his name has come up a number of times over the last 2 or 3 years. I think in large part because Oliver Ekman-Larsson in Arizona has emerged as really an elite young defenseman. So maybe the feeling was that Keith Yandle didn't fit long term, given what his salary demands may be after his contract ends at the end of next year. But he's a sort of high risk, high reward kind of player. I know the riverboat gambler kind of label has been affixed to him. Going to the New York Rangers, it's also apparently an acknowledgement that the Dan Boyle experiment hasn't worked out the way the Rangers thought. They signed Dan Boyle, much older, but similar kind of defenseman in the offseason last year. How do you see Keith Yandle fitting, and maybe what happens to Dan Boyle in New York?
Well, being in Dallas, for the last 7 years, I did see a lot of Keith Yandle, particularly since they were in our division. And I think that in getting a player like Yandle, they are getting one of the premier offensive defensemen that are quite hard to find. This is kind of your classic trade deadline formula deal where, if you're the Arizona Coyotes, I always refer to them as Phoenix, but if you're the Arizona Coyotes, you're looking, when you have a player like this, to get a top pick, a top prospect, and ideally a serviceable roster player. And they've accomplished that. And I think to your point, they really are a team that probably can't afford to sort of #1 defenseman salaries on their team. They've got to pick and choose, and so clearly they've went with Oliver Ekman-Larsson, which they should, and they trade to the New York Rangers a player that you talked about Dan Boyle. Keith Yandle's a lot younger than Dan Boyle.
Sure. Just before we close, in terms of the Arizona Coyotes, they get Anthony Duclair, played very well with Max Domi, another Arizona Coyotes prospect at the World Juniors. Can you read too much into that, or do you like the package that the Coyotes get from the Rangers in this deal?
I like the package the Coyotes get. They solve 2 needs. One is they check the box that they make a trade with the New York Rangers, which they seem to do at every trade deadline. And 2, I wouldn't project too much off of the World Juniors because it's a fairly small time sample. But what they do get is a player that, despite the fact he was drafted in the 3rd round, they get an A prospect. And they also get a 1st-round pick. So they've really checked both those boxes. I think for the Arizona Coyotes, this is a win. This is a great return for them. And for the New York Rangers, who many people see the East as wide open this year, it's a win for them.
Good. Well, we'll see how it all turns out, and we hope you'll stay with ESPN.com for all of your trade coverage. For Frank Provenzano, I'm Scott Burnside.